She married him to keep her sisters out of the orphanage. He married her to keep his word. The letter from the county clerk arrived on a Monday, and by Tuesday morning, Elspeth Garrity understood that her life was about to change in a way she could not prevent. The letter said that a single woman of 23 could not serve as legal guardian to 2 minor children without proof of stable household, which the clerk defined as either a husband or a property deed of sufficient value. Elspeth had neither. What she had was 2 younger sisters, Ada, who was 14, and Bess, who was 9, and a rented room above the dry goods store in Bitter Creek, Colorado, and a job washing linens at the hotel that paid $4 a week. Their father, Henry Garrity, had died in a mine collapse 6 weeks ago. Their mother had been gone since Bess was born. The mine company had paid a settlement of $60, which Elspeth had stretched as far as it would go, and the county had given her 8 weeks to demonstrate that she could provide a stable home for her sisters. The 8 weeks were up. Elspeth sat at the table in the rented room and read the letter again. Ada sat across from her, old enough to understand what it meant. Bess sat on the bed, braiding a piece of string, not understanding and not needing to, because that was what older sisters were for. "They cannot take us," Ada said. Her voice was flat and hard, the voice of a 14-year-old who had already learned that the world was not organized for her benefit. "They can," Elspeth said. "They will, unless I find a solution." "What solution?" Elspeth folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket and did not answer, because the only solution she could think of was one she was not yet ready to say aloud. Nolan Whitaker owned a cattle ranch 3 miles north of Bitter Creek. He was 31, broad through the chest, quiet in his manner, and known in the valley as a man who did not make promises he could not keep. He had known Henry Garrity from the years when Henry had worked as a ranch hand before the mine took him. They had not been close friends, but they had shared the particular bond of men who worked hard and expected nothing in return, and found that nothing was usually what they got. Nolan had been at the mine when they brought Henry out. He had helped carry the body to the wagon, and he had stood in the yard while Elspeth came running from the hotel and saw the blanket and understood. He had caught her when her legs gave out. He had held her upright while she screamed into his shoulder, and the sound of it had stayed with him, the way certain sounds stay, not in the ears but in the chest, where they settle and do not leave. In the weeks after the funeral, Nolan had gone about his work with a heaviness that had nothing to do with the labor. He fed his cattle, and mended his fences, and ate his suppers alone, and thought about Henry Garrity's 3 daughters, and the rented room above the dry goods store, and the $4 a week that stood between them and the street. He thought about it the way a man thinks about a wound he cannot reach, constantly, helplessly, with the understanding that thinking was not the same as acting, but unable to stop. He had told Henry once, during a conversation that neither of them expected to matter, that he would look after the girls if anything happened. Henry had laughed and said nothing was going to happen. Nolan had not laughed. He had simply nodded, because a promise was a promise whether the other person took it seriously or not. Elspeth came to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon. She came alone, having left Ada in charge of Bess, and she rode the 3 miles on a borrowed horse, with the county letter in her pocket, and her pride in her throat, like a bone she could not swallow. Nolan was in the barn mending harness when she found him. He looked up and saw her face and set the harness down. "The county is going to take my sisters," she said, "unless I can prove a stable household, a husband or a property deed." Nolan said nothing for a moment. He stood in the barn with the hay dust floating in the light, and his hands still holding the shape of the harness he had set down. "I do not have a property deed," Elspeth said. "I have $4 a week and a rented room, and 2 sisters who are the only family I have left in this world. I need a husband. I am not asking for love. I am asking for a name on a piece of paper that will keep my sisters out of the orphanage." Nolan looked at her. She was standing in the barn door with the afternoon sun behind her, and she was shaking, not from cold but from the effort of saying what she had come to say. Her hands were clenched at her sides and her jaw was set, and her eyes were bright with a fury that was directed not at him, but at the world that had put her in this position. "I told your father I would look after you," Nolan said. "I know. Ada told me." "Then you know my answer. They were married on Friday, by the circuit judge, in the parlor of Nolan's ranch house, with Ada and Bess as witnesses. The judge read the words, and Nolan said yes, and Elspeth said yes, and the piece of paper that would keep her sisters was signed and witnessed and filed. It took 11 minutes. The rest of their lives started when the judge's wagon pulled out of the yard. Ada had held Bess's hand through the ceremony and had not let go afterward. She looked at Nolan with the wary attention of a girl who had learned that men made promises and that promises could break. Nolan looked back at her with the steadiness that was the only kind of reassurance he knew how to give. He did not try to win her over. He did not try to be her father. He simply existed in the same space and waited for whatever would happen to happen. The ranch house had 3 rooms, a kitchen, a main room with a fireplace, and a bedroom. Nolan gave the bedroom to Elspeth and her sisters, and moved his things to the loft above the kitchen, a space that had been used for storage, and was not built for sleeping, but was adequate for a man who had slept in worse places. He said nothing about the arrangement. Elspeth said nothing about it either. They had married for a purpose, and the purpose had been achieved, and whatever else the marriage might become was a question neither of them was ready to ask. The first weeks were difficult, in the way that any forced intimacy is difficult. Elspeth cooked and cleaned and managed the house with a fierce efficiency that was less about housekeeping and more about control. She could not control the county or the mine or the world that had taken her parents, but she could control whether the floors were swept and the biscuits rose. Nolan worked the cattle and the fences and came in for meals, and was polite and careful, and maintained a distance that was measured not in feet, but in the particular quality of attention he paid to not looking at her too long. But the distance had cracks in it. One morning, Elspeth came downstairs to find that Nolan had already lit the stove and put the coffee on, and beside the coffee pot was a jar of wildflowers, purple asters, picked from the field behind the barn. He did not mention them. She did not mention them. The flowers sat on the table between their 2 plates, like a sentence neither of them had finished. Another morning, she found him in the barn before dawn, mending the halter on the horse she rode to town. The halter had been fraying for a week, and she had meant to fix it herself, and here it was, already done. The leather oiled and the buckle tightened and the broken strap replaced. She hung it on its hook and stood in the barn in the dark and pressed her hand against the mended strap and felt something she had no name for. Ada watched all of this with the sharp eyes of a girl who understood more than anyone gave her credit for. She saw the way Nolan left the house before Elspeth woke and came back after she had gone to bed. She saw the way they spoke to each other with the careful formality of strangers sharing a train compartment. She saw the 2 plates, the 2 chairs, the 2 separate orbits of 2 people who had agreed to share a life, but not a world. Bess, who was 9 and operated on a different frequency entirely, climbed into Nolan's lap on the 3rd evening and asked him to read her a story. Nolan looked at Elspeth. Elspeth looked at Bess. Bess looked at both of them with the patient expectation of a child who did not understand why adults made simple things complicated. Nolan read her a story. It was the only book in the house, a battered copy of Robinson Crusoe that had been his mother's, and he read it haltingly, because he was not a man accustomed to reading aloud. Bess fell asleep against his chest before the 2nd chapter, and Nolan sat very still in the chair, afraid to move, looking at the sleeping child with an expression that he did not know Elspeth could see. She could see it. She was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, a dishcloth in her hands, and she could see everything, the careful way he held Bess, the way his breathing had slowed to match the child's, the way his hand rested on the small back, as though it had always belonged there. Something cracked in the wall Elspeth had built between what this marriage was and what it might become, and she turned away before the crack could spread. The weeks accumulated. Nolan built a 2nd bedroom onto the house, framing it out of pine he cut from the ridge above the ranch, because he said the girls should have their own room. He built it with a window that faced the mountains, and a shelf for books and a hook for Ada's coat, and he did it without being asked, and Elspeth stood in the finished room and pressed her hand against the fresh sawn wood and felt the care in it, the way you feel the heat of a stove, not because you see the fire, but because the warmth reaches you. Ada began helping with the cattle. She was strong for her age and quick to learn, and Nolan taught her to saddle a horse and mend a fence and read the sky for weather the way he read it, looking for the clouds that meant rain and the light that meant storm. Ada, who had not trusted a man since her father died, trusted Nolan, and the trust showed in the way she followed him to the barn each morning without being told. Bess planted a garden. Elspeth had mentioned once that their mother had kept a garden, and the next morning Bess was on her knees in the yard with a stick, drawing rows in the dirt. Nolan brought her seeds from town, beans and squash and sunflowers, and Bess planted them with the serious concentration of a child who believes that growing things is the most important work in the world. The county inspector came in August. He was a thin man with spectacles and a clipboard, and the air of someone who had seen every possible arrangement and was prepared to disapprove of most of them. He walked through the house and looked at the bedrooms and the kitchen and the garden. He spoke to Ada and Bess separately. He looked at the marriage certificate and the property deed and the new room that Nolan had built. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, "how long have you known the Garrity family?" "Since before Ada was born," Nolan said. "I worked with their father." "And your marriage to Miss Garrity, Mrs. Whitaker, this was a decision made for the children's welfare." Nolan looked at the inspector. Then he looked at Elspeth, who was standing by the stove with her hands clasped and her face carefully neutral. "I married Elspeth because her father was my friend, and I gave him my word," Nolan said, "and because her sisters deserve a home, and she deserves someone who stands by her. If that is not reason enough, I do not know what would be." The inspector wrote something on his clipboard. He looked at Bess's garden and Ada's muddy boots by the door, and the shelf of books in the girls' room, and the quilt on the bed that Elspeth had sewn from scraps. He closed his clipboard. "The household appears stable," he said. "I will file my report accordingly." After the inspector left, Elspeth sat on the porch and cried. She cried the way a person cries when something they have been holding together finally holds on its own, not from sadness, but from the sudden, overwhelming absence of fear. Nolan stood in the doorway and watched her and did not speak, because he understood that some tears need space, not company. When she was finished, she wiped her face and looked at him. "You did not have to say what you said," she told him, "about standing by me. The inspector only needed the certificate and the deed." "I know what he needed," Nolan said. "I said what was true." That night, Elspeth moved her pillow from the bedroom to the loft, where Nolan was sitting on the edge of his cot looking surprised. "The girls have their own room now," she said. "This arrangement no longer makes sense." "What arrangement makes sense?" "The one where you stop sleeping in a loft and I stop pretending that this marriage is only a piece of paper." Nolan looked at her. The lamplight was behind her, and he could not see her face clearly, but he could hear her voice, and it was steady and sure and without pretense. "I am not good at this," he said, "at saying things. You are better than you think. You said exactly the right thing to the inspector. That was different. That was the truth. This is harder." "This is also the truth," Elspeth said. "It is just a different kind." He stood up from the cot. He was taller than her by a head, and in the small space of the loft, they were close enough that she could see the pulse in his throat and the uncertain set of his mouth. "I married you to keep my word," he said. "But I am staying because of you. Not the word, you." Elspeth put her hand on his chest, over the place where the pulse was, and felt his heart beating the way it beat, steadily, reliably, without excess or show. "That is exactly the right thing," she said. The marriage that had started as a piece of paper became something else entirely, the way a seed becomes a garden, not all at once but in stages, each one building on the last. Ada grew taller and steadier and smiled more than she had in years. Bess's sunflowers reached the eaves of the porch. Nolan read Robinson Crusoe aloud every night until they finished it, and then he started it again, because Bess asked him to. The woman who had married a stranger to save her sisters discovered that she had also saved herself. The man who had married to keep a promise discovered that the keeping of it was the best thing he had ever done, and the piece of paper that had started it all sat in a drawer in the kitchen, underneath the marriage certificate, which sat underneath a letter from the county clerk, that nobody read anymore, because the answer to every question it had asked was standing in the yard, growing sunflowers.